Barbara Kutzner. I'm the agronomist for DEKALB here in California. Today's topic is the nitrogen requirement of silage corn and the application timing of nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen is considered a macronutrient. It's in the group of N, P, and K, and it's called a macronutrient because plants require it in large quantities. Nitrogen is part of proteins in the plant, so it is required for all green tissue growth, but it's also required for the ear development and the kernel development. In terms of requirements, the requirements of small plants are fairly little, but then as soon as a plant reach the V8 to V10 stage up to tasseling, they need a lot of nitrogen, and within that 30-day window from V8 to tasseling, the plants take up about half of the nitrogen supply, and then the remaining 1/3 of the nitrogen is then required for the reproductive stages. Overall, as a rule of thumb, we are calculating about 8 to 9 pounds of nitrogen per 1 ton of silage corn. So if you're shooting, let's say, for a 30-ton yield goal, that would require about 250 to 260 pounds of nitrogen. And your yield goal should be really realistically based on your growing environment, on your soil type, on the type of hybrid that you are planting. In terms of fertilizer timing, in my mind, there are 3 buckets. There are pre-plant applications, and that would be your manure application or a broadcast application of commercial fertilizer. The second bucket is the at-planting bucket, and that would be your pop-up fertilizer or your banded starter fertilizer that are being applied when you are planting the crop. And the third bucket is the in-crop or in-season application, and that is your side dress or your water run nitrogen, and also your run of lagoon water, which is in a way water run nitrogen. So let's talk about different scenarios, and I think it's a good idea to really differentiate between manured fields and fields that are not manured. So let's start out with the non-manured fields. I think for those situations it's a good idea to do a pre-plant nitrate test. That gives you basically a baseline of the nitrogen content at the beginning of planting. And then depending on that chart, and we will include those in the video, you can decide if it is a good idea to apply a starter fertilizer. And then it also gives you basically an idea how much nitrogen you have to apply to get to your yield goal. Let's go over to the manured situations, and that is very, very common here in the Central Valley because silage is being grown on many dairies to provide the feed for the dairies. As a rule of thumb, normally manured fields do not need a starter fertilizer. If manure was applied during the fall or the spring, there is plenty of nitrogen in the soil to give those plants a good start. In those situations, it's also not really beneficial to do a pre-plant nitrate test because you have a lot of manure or organic matter still being mineralized. So in these situations, I would recommend that you do a pre-side dress nitrate test. That is normally done at the V5 to V6 stage, and it is only done in the first foot of the soil layers. And depending on the value, you can decide if you do need a side dress or not. As a rule of thumb, if that value is higher than 25 ppm in the first foot of soil, then you normally don't need to side dress the corn. If it is lower, we can reference that table again. You can apply the nitrogen either by side dress or water run nitrogen to get to your requirement for your yield goal. Let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of side dress versus water run applications. The biggest concern with side dress is really that you get too close to the plant. If you run those shanks too close to the plant, like less than 7 inches, you run the chance of root pruning, and also you can nick the plant. Even the dry dirt clods can nick the plants and create little wounds, and then pathogens can enter through those wounds. And we have seen some cases where, for instance, Pythium had entered the plants and we ended up having Pythium stalk rot. So that's just a watch out in general for side dress applications. On water run applications, you have more the danger of loss of nitrogen through volatilization, or also through runoff. That part of the water that contains the nitrogen runs off at the end of the furrow or the check. When you're applying lagoon water as a nitrogen source, it's very important that you get lab analysis of your nutrient content. First of all, lagoons are not very homogeneous. Depending on where you are pulling the water from, the nutrient content can really vary. So make sure that you get an up-to-date lab analysis of the portion that you are using. Then also make sure that you have enough runtime to ensure adequate supply with nitrogen to your crop. Another issue that arises sometimes when we have very high yielding hybrids is that they need a lot of nitrogen, and that nitrogen cannot be applied in one setting. So we are recommending split applications. So you would apply a pre-plant broadcast application of commercial fertilizer or manure, and then follow up with an in-season application, either as side dress or water run. Another option is to apply controlled release fertilizers, and those are fertilizers that contain compounds that slow down the conversion of urea or ammonium N into nitrate. So that really is basically a slow release of your nitrogen source, and that is really a good idea for crops that need a lot of nitrogen at the very end. Last but not least, I want to talk about different nitrogen monitoring options, because I mean, let's be honest, all the soil testing is basically a crutch. We don't really know how much is being taken up, and sometimes it's a good idea to do a tissue analysis. Many times people do that because they see nutrient deficiency symptoms, and in corn that would be the firing up of the lower leaves at the end of the season. The classic symptom is actually an inverted V, a chlorotic V on the lower leaves, and that means that the nitrogen has been depleted from these leaves. Nitrogen is an extremely mobile element, and it goes there where the need is the highest. So if the ear is developing, the plant pulls nitrogen from the lower leaves and from the stalks up into the ear, and that is why you are seeing the symptoms on the lower leaves. So you can do a tissue analysis, and the tissue analysis can tell you if your crop was nitrogen deficient. Unfortunately, it cannot tell you how much you should apply to get out of that deficiency. So fast forward to harvest time. Let's say your crop did not meet the yield goal that you had realistically set for yourself, and you suspect that there might be nitrogen deficiency part of the reason. So you can do a stalk analysis. That's actually fairly cumbersome. You have to cut the lower stalks and analyze those for nitrogen, and the normal range is between 3,500 and 5,000 ppm, and if the level is lower than that, it is indicative of having nitrogen deficiency in the crop. A much easier method is actually looking at the protein content of the crop, and most dairymen do that anyway as part of their silage quality analysis. So the protein content in a regular crop that is not deficient is about 6.5 to 7.5% protein, and if that falls below that range, that's also an indicator that you have fallen short on your nitrogen supply. And then the last test that some people do is a post-harvest nitrate analysis, and that is actually more of a tool for future management, because if you have a ton of nitrate still left in your soil after harvest, you might rethink your fertilizer management, because I mean, if you have that much left, it might be likely that it might leach and so on. So that's probably not a good situation. On the other hand, if you have a very, very low content, you might think, well, maybe the corn did not get enough nitrogen. So I hope I answered a lot of your questions, and stay tuned for our next video. Thank you.